Ziria's flagship glided through the fringes of her empire, a sleek silver construct that shimmered against the endless black of space. She sat in her private chamber, her elaborate headdress catching the soft glow of her desk's interface. Her slender fingers, adorned with iridescent rings, moved across the console as she scanned the latest reports. Nothing of interest, until she reached the file marked Sol 01, a human colony on the edge of her dominion. A few million settlers, resource-rich and developing faster than projections had anticipated. The humans hadn't yet formally requested entry into the Empire, nor had they made any overtures of submission. This lack of deference annoyed her. After all, hers was a domain that spanned 1,000 worlds. The idea that a fledgling human colony wouldn't immediately fall in line was as baffling as it was irritating. "They're undisciplined," she murmured to herself. "A species of opportunists who don't understand the order we bring." A soft chime sounded. The doors to her chamber slid open, and her chief advisor, Vinus, stepped in. The old strategist's blue-scaled face was lined with decades of service. His multiple eyes blinked in unison as he approached, holding a data pad. "Your Majesty, the fleet reports they'll reach Sol 01 within the hour. Shall I prepare the ground teams for immediate occupation?" "Occupation?" Ziria raised an eyebrow. "We haven't even spoken to their leaders." Vinus hesitated. "With respect, humans are known for their stubbornness. It would be more efficient to demonstrate strength before negotiation. A swift show of force will." "No." Ziria rose from her seat. Her gown of liquid-like fabric shimmered as she paced the chamber. "I want to meet them first. A colony that has grown this quickly may hold surprises. I need to see what these humans are made of." "As you wish," Vinus said, bowing. "I'll make the arrangements." The colony's surface was far less impressive than Ziria's worlds. The atmosphere was breathable but harsh, with biting winds that swept across the jagged cliffs surrounding the settlement. Prefabricated structures clustered together in a rough circle, their metallic exteriors weathered by the elements. The humans were industrious, she had to admit, but their efforts lacked elegance. Still, the settlement teemed with activity. Machines whirred, people shouted orders, and vehicles ferried materials to and fro. Ziria's arrival caused a stir. Her retinue of guards, clad in sleek, reflective armor, spread out around her as she descended the ramp of her shuttle. Colonists gathered, their faces a mix of awe and suspicion. She could feel their eyes on her, the whispers passing from one to the next. She stopped at the base of the ramp, her head held high. "Bring me your leader," she commanded. "I wish to speak with whoever speaks for your people." The crowd parted, and a man stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair tousled by the wind. His clothing was simple, a worn jacket over a plain shirt and utility pants, but he carried himself with a confidence that caught her attention. He didn't bow. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked her directly in the eyes. "I'm Elias," he said. "I suppose I'm as close to a leader as you're going to get. What do you want?" Ziria blinked, momentarily taken aback by his tone. It had been centuries since anyone had spoken to her so casually, let alone a mere human colonist. She recovered quickly, her voice firm. "I am Empress Ziria, sovereign of 1,000 worlds. I've come to understand why your colony has not requested inclusion in my empire." Elias crossed his arms. "Didn't realize we needed to ask permission to exist." "You don't," she replied, her tone icy. "But you do need permission to prosper in my territory. Tell me, why haven't you petitioned for membership?" "Most colonies do so within months of establishing themselves." Elias smirked. "Because we're not like most colonies. We're here to make our own way, not to join some massive intergalactic bureaucracy." "Bureaucracy?" Her eyes narrowed. "You would reduce my empire to mere paperwork?" "No offense," Elias said, "but you're not exactly helping your case by showing up uninvited and demanding answers." Ziria's retinue stiffened at the perceived insolence, but she raised a hand, silencing them. "You misunderstand. I am not demanding answers. I am offering you a chance to align yourselves with something greater." My empire brings order, stability, and prosperity. Joining us would. Look, Elias cut in. I appreciate the offer, but we're fine on our own. We've got water, energy, resources. We're not interested in trading independence for order. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. You would rather remain isolated than benefit from the protection and opportunities my empire provides? Protection from what? Elias gestured to the sky. We haven't seen any threats out here. We just want to be left alone. You are short-sighted, Ziria said sharply. There are dangers beyond your understanding. My empire's presence here is a shield against those threats. Elias tilted his head, studying her. Maybe, but we've done fine so far, and I'd rather not be part of someone else's chessboard. If that's all you came here to talk about, you've got your answer. Ziria's jaw tightened. So that's your final word? For now, yeah, he replied. But if you ever want to come back and visit, without the empire talk, I'll buy you a drink. His casual offer made her pause. The man was either brave or foolish, or perhaps both. Without another word, she turned and ascended the ramp back to her shuttle, her retinue following close behind. As the shuttle lifted off, Ziria found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. No one had spoken to her like that in decades. It was frustrating and intriguing. Perhaps this human colony held more value than she had anticipated. If only because it had produced a man who could defy her so effortlessly. Chapter 2. The Outsider's Defiance. The command center aboard Ziria's flagship hummed with activity. It was an angular, gleaming space where every console and panel displayed data from across her empire. Ziria stood at the observation deck, staring out at the vast expanse of stars. Her mind replayed the meeting with Elias. His boldness, his refusal to bow, his plain-spoken defiance. Vinas approached, his blue-scaled form casting a long shadow. Your Majesty, the human representative has been summoned as requested. He will arrive momentarily. Shall we prepare a diplomatic briefing? No, Ziria said firmly, turning to face her advisor. I want to speak to him directly. No formalities, no scripted rhetoric. I need to understand why he thinks he can reject me. Vinas hesitated. But your security is not in question? She cut him off. You will remain present, but at a distance. Elias is just a man, not a threat. I'm more interested in his mind than his strength. Vinas inclined his head. As you wish, Empress. Minutes later, Elias stepped into the chamber. The guards flanking the doorway gave him cautious glances, but he seemed unimpressed by the grand surroundings. His stance was relaxed, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket. He didn't look like someone about to face the ruler of 1,000 worlds. More like a man wandering into a local council meeting. You called, he said, glancing around the room. His eyes landed on Ziria, and he tilted his head. Nice ship. What can I do for you this time? Ziria studied him for a moment before speaking. You've seen the scope of my empire. You know what I represent. Yet you refuse to join us. Why? Elias leaned against a nearby console, crossing his arms. I told you before, we don't want to trade independence for control. We like making our own decisions. Your independence is an illusion, she replied. You rely on resources from your planet, your system's natural energy. What happens when those run out? What happens when a greater force comes to claim what you have? Then we deal with it, Elias said simply. We're not the kind to wait for someone else to solve our problems. And we sure don't need some all-powerful empress telling us how to live our lives. Ziria's lips tightened. Your stubbornness will only lead to ruin. If you align with me, you gain stability, trade opportunities, access to knowledge beyond your wildest imaginings. Sounds like a great sales pitch, Elias replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm. But here's the thing, we've got everything we need. Water, food, energy. Sure, it's not fancy, but we like it that way. She stepped closer, her gaze sharp. Do you think I'm offering this out of pity or charity? Your colony's location is strategically valuable. I'm giving you a chance to benefit from something you cannot achieve on your own. Elias pushed off the console, meeting her gaze head-on. Maybe we can't, but at least it'll be ours. You don't get that, do you? The idea that someone might want to build something without answering to a higher power. Ziria's tone grew colder. I understand perfectly. I also understand that your attitude endangers your people. Refusing my empire's protection means leaving them vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? Your empire? Or are you going to protect us from threats that don't exist just so we owe you something? She straightened, her voice steely. You misunderstand me. My empire doesn't threaten. It offers stability and unity. Your refusal to see that is not only foolish but reckless. And yet here I am, Elias said, his voice calm but firm. Standing on your ship, telling you no. If you were half as tyrannical as you think I believe, I'd already be in a cell. But you're not. You're curious, aren't you? You don't understand why someone would refuse you. That's why I'm here. Ziria narrowed her eyes. Careful, human. I tolerate your defiance for now, but that tolerance has limits. Elias shrugged. Fair enough. But think about this. If you really believe in your empire's greatness, you don't need me to kneel. You need to prove it's worth kneeling for. Until then, we're fine standing on our own. For a moment, silence filled the chamber. Ziria's advisors looked on nervously, unsure of how she would respond. The Empress finally turned away from Elias, her expression unreadable. Return him to the surface, she ordered. We'll speak again another time. As Elias was escorted out, he glanced back at Ziria. Anytime you want to talk, I'm here. Just without the demands next time. She didn't respond, but the weight of his words lingered. As the doors slid shut behind him, Ziria sat in her chair, her thoughts consumed by the human who had dared to speak to her as an equal. Chapter 3. A dangerous invitation. Elias had barely settled back into life on the colony when he received the message. The Empress herself had invited him aboard her flagship, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. His first instinct was to refuse. He had no intention of becoming another piece on her interstellar chessboard. But curiosity and, if he was being honest, a certain stubbornness got the better of him. He replied, I'll come, but only to talk. When he arrived aboard the flagship's docking bay, the contrast to the rugged simplicity of the colony was overwhelming. Sleek corridors of silver and blue stretched into the distance, lit by a soft glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A pair of Ziria's attendants, their intricate, feather-like headpieces marking their station, greeted him wordlessly and escorted him to the Empress's chamber. Ziria stood waiting, her presence commanding as ever. Her gown shifted with her movements, catching the light in ways that seemed almost alive. She looked at him with a mix of intrigue and expectation. You came. That's a start. Elias crossed his arms, nodding curtly. Figured I owed it to myself to hear what you had to say. She motioned to a seating area where an elegant, low table was set with delicacies he didn't recognize. Sit. Eat if you like. I'll stand, Elias said. He had no intention of relaxing in her presence, no matter how gracious her invitation seemed. Very well. Ziria tilted her head slightly, as if studying a particularly interesting specimen. You intrigue me, Elias. Few would turn down what I offer. Fewer still would do so with such conviction. I want to understand why. Elias exhaled, his arms falling to his sides. It's not that complicated. We just want to live our lives without someone else telling us what we can and can't do. That kind of independence comes at a cost, Ziria replied. You could lose everything to one bad harvest, one unlucky solar storm. My empire can ensure your colony's survival through all of that. Maybe, Elias admitted. But survival isn't the same as living. If we give up what makes us who we are, what's the point? If your empire guarantees safety by taking away our choices, then it's just another kind of cage. Ziria's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained sharp. You speak of freedom as if it's more valuable than stability. Sometimes it is. Elias gestured around the opulent room. Look at this place. You've got all the stability in the universe, but are you free? I mean, when's the last time you made a choice that wasn't about maintaining control? For a moment, Ziria said nothing. The question lingered, heavy in the air. You assume much about me. Elias shrugged. I call it like I see it. You're bold. I'll grant you that, she said, her tone softening just slightly. Most would not speak to me this way. Maybe that's part of the problem, Elias said. If nobody's willing to question you, how do you know when you're wrong? Ziria's eyes narrowed. You think I'm wrong now? I think you're looking at things from the top down, seeing everything as a piece of your empire. But not everyone wants to be part of that. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. And maybe not everything needs to be. The room grew silent again. Ziria stepped closer, her head tilted in thought. You're different, Elias. Not just in how you speak, but in how you think. I wonder if that difference might be useful. Elias gave a short laugh. Useful, huh? What does that mean? Perhaps it's worth seeing what you can offer in a less formal setting, she said. Come with me to one of my worlds. I'll show you what the Empire provides, what life could be like under my rule. Consider it an experiment. And what happens if I say no? He asked. Then we part ways, Ziria said simply. I'll leave your colony be for now, but you'd be passing up the chance to truly understand what you're refusing. Elias hesitated. The offer wasn't without risk. But if he could see more of her world, maybe he'd find the leverage he needed to keep the colony out of her grip. All right, he said finally. I'll go with you, but don't expect me to change my mind. Ziria's faint smile returned. Good. Let's see what happens when a man from nowhere and a ruler of everything stand on equal ground. Elias didn't bother hiding his smirk. That's the thing, Empress. I've always stood on equal ground. I think you're the one catching up. Chapter 4. Across the Divide. The shuttle descended through the atmosphere of Halorex Prime, one of the crown jewels of Ziria's empire. The planet's lush landscape unfolded below, with vast forests of crystalline trees that glimmered under the blue-tinged sunlight. Rivers of liquid light wound through the valleys, their iridescent flow visible even from high above. Elias stared out the window, arms crossed, clearly trying not to look impressed. Say what you want about the Empire, he muttered. But you've got some nice scenery. Ziria, seated across from him, raised a brow. You expected barren wastelands, perhaps? Not quite, he said, leaning back. Just not this. The shuttle touched down on a floating platform above a bustling city. From their vantage point, Elias could see spires made of what appeared to be flowing metal, twisting and shifting as though alive. Beings of various species moved about below, their movements coordinated like a choreographed dance. Welcome to Halorex Prime, Ziria said as the doors opened. She led him down the ramp, her steps graceful, almost effortless. Elias followed, his boots clanking on the polished surface. Feels like a tourist trip so far, Elias quipped, glancing around. Where's the hard sell? This is no sales pitch, Ziria replied coolly. I want you to see the truth of my empire, to understand what it offers beyond words. They walked side by side into the city's main thoroughfare. The streets were filled with activity. Merchants displayed goods from across the galaxy, children chased floating orbs of light, and musicians played instruments that produced harmonies unlike anything Elias had ever heard. Ziria occasionally paused to acknowledge a bow or a greeting, her presence commanding attention without any need for words. So, what am I supposed to take away from all this? Elias asked. That your empire's a well-oiled machine? That it is more than you assume, Ziria said. These people live under my rule, yes, but look at them. They thrive. They prosper. Is that not worth something? Elias stopped in front of a stall where an alien vendor was selling small, glowing fruits. He picked one up, examining it closely. Sure, it looks great, he said. But what happens when someone steps out of line? When someone decides they don't want to prosper your way? Ziria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step closer and gestured for the vendor to hand her one of the fruits. She held it up, turning it over in her hands. Laws are necessary, Structure is necessary. Without them, even this beauty would crumble. That's a nice metaphor, Elias said, taking a bite of the fruit. It was sweet and slightly effervescent, the taste unlike anything he'd experienced before. But it doesn't answer my question. You assume the worst of my empire because you've never seen it from the inside, Ziria said, her voice calm. If you take the time to learn. I'm not staying, Elias interrupted. I told you, I'm here to see what you have to offer, not to sign up. And yet you remain curious, Ziria noted, stepping away from the stall and motioning for him to follow. Come, there is more I wish to show you. She led him through a maze of streets and into a grand hall where dozens of species were engaged in what looked like a negotiation. The air hummed with a mix of languages, yet Ziria's presence silenced the room as she entered. All eyes turned to her. Continue, she said, her voice resonating through the chamber. The delegates resumed their discussions, the tension easing slightly. This, Ziria said, turning to Elias, is one of our interstellar councils. Representatives from multiple worlds come here to resolve disputes, to discuss trade, to foster understanding. This is what my empire achieves. Cooperation among species that would otherwise never speak to each other. Elias observed the room for a moment. I'll admit it's impressive, he said. But I've seen too many utopias turn into something else entirely once you dig deep enough. You doubt because you have no frame of reference, Ziria said, her tone firm but not unkind. You see only what you know, a colony struggling to survive. This is what survival becomes when given the proper guidance. Elias crossed his arms. And all it costs is a little freedom, right? Ziria looked at him, her expression unreadable. Cal guards. Elias glanced at Ziria. You want me to see what the Empire offers? Show me how you handle that. Ziria frowned but nodded. They stepped outside, the crowd parting as they approached. The colonists were demanding more resources than their allocation allowed. Ziria listened to their grievances before speaking softly to the guards. The situation de-escalated quickly, the colonists agreeing to return with their representatives to discuss the matter in council. That's how you do it? Elias asked once the commotion had passed. Every situation requires its own solution, Ziria said, and every individual must understand their place within the greater whole. Elias studied her for a moment before nodding. You're not what I expected, Empress. Neither are you, Elias. Her voice was almost gentle now. But perhaps that is why we continue to talk. Chapter 5: The Fragile Bond. The air aboard Ziria's flagship was unusually still as she entered the private conference chamber. It was a far cry from the bustling command center or the elegant observation deck. Here, the walls were smooth and unadorned, the lighting subdued. A single circular table sat in the center, and around it, a projection of the galaxy hovered, its countless stars pulsing faintly in the dim light. Elias was already seated at one end of the table, arms folded, his boots propped up on the edge. Make yourself comfortable, Ziria said dryly as she entered. I was just admiring the view, Elias replied, smirking. He gestured to the galaxy projection. Not every day you get a private tour of the Empire's star maps. She settled into the chair opposite him, her movements precise. You might want to refrain from putting your feet on the Empire's property. Noted. He swung his legs down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. So, what's the occasion? You called me here for something, right? Ziria studied him for a moment, then dismissed the projection with a flick of her hand. The room grew darker, lit only by the faint glow of the table's edge. I've been considering our conversations, she began, and the ways in which your colony has managed to thrive despite limited resources. I admit it intrigues me. Elias raised an eyebrow. You mean it bothers you? Perhaps, she admitted, folding her hands. But it also raises questions I cannot answer. I've built an empire of unparalleled scale, and yet your small colony holds a kind of determination that's difficult to quantify. Determination, Elias repeated, clearly amused. You almost sound like you're impressed. Don't flatter yourself, she said, though her tone lacked the sharpness it might have had before. You're impulsive, short-sighted, and unreasonably stubborn. But there is something to be learned from your defiance. Well, I'm flattered now, Elias said, leaning back. So what are you planning to do with all these questions? Write a research paper. Ziria tilted her head slightly. In a sense, yes, but not with words. I want to understand your methods, your approach to leadership, your ability to inspire loyalty despite offering no guarantees of success. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, clearly skeptical. You make it sound more glamorous than it is. Most of what we do is just figuring out how to survive without losing sight of who we are. And who are you, Elias? She asked, her voice softening just a fraction. What drives someone to reject security, power, and stability in favor of uncertainty? He hesitated. For a moment, his cocky demeanor slipped, revealing something more serious. Maybe it's not so much about rejecting those things. It's about deciding for ourselves what they mean. If we fail, it's on us. If we succeed, it's ours to claim. I guess you'd call it foolish pride. Perhaps, Ziria said, a faint smile touching her lips. Or perhaps it's something else. She rose and gestured for him to follow. They walked together down a long corridor that opened onto a large viewing deck. The vastness of space stretched out before them, dotted with the faint glimmers of distant stars. They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, the tension between them giving way to a tentative camaraderie. Your people remind me of my own beginnings, Ziria said finally. Before the Empire, my world was not so different from yours. We fought to carve out our place, to survive in a galaxy that seemed determined to crush us. Elias glanced at her, curious. I thought you were born into power. No, she replied, shaking her head. Power was something I had to take, to forge from chaos. And once I had it, I could never let it go. Not if I wanted my people to endure. He leaned against the railing, his tone thoughtful. It's not so different then. We're just at an earlier stage. Perhaps, she said. But the path you've chosen will only grow more difficult. If you refuse the Empire's support, you may find that your pride is not enough to sustain you. Maybe not, Elias admitted. But if it comes down to it, I'd rather fail on our terms than succeed on someone else's. Ziria turned to face him, her gaze searching. And you truly believe that? That independence is worth such a risk? I do, he said firmly. And I think you do too, deep down. She didn't respond right away, instead gazing out at the stars. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Perhaps I did once. The moment stretched on, the silence heavy but not uncomfortable. It was as though the vast expanse of the galaxy had momentarily closed in, leaving just the two of them in its orbit. For the first time, Ziria felt the weight of her role lessen, if only slightly. In Elias's defiance, she saw not just opposition, but a spark of something she hadn't encountered in years, a willingness to challenge her, to question her, and to stand as an equal rather than a subject. As they turned to leave the viewing deck, their steps fell into sync. They didn't speak, but the unspoken understanding between them grew stronger. Two individuals from worlds apart, walking a shared path, even if only for a short while. Chapter 6. Kisses in the Starlight. The evening glow of Antares Ivy's twin moons bathed the sky in a cool silver light. The lush gardens surrounding the imperial retreat hummed faintly with bioluminescent flora, casting shifting patterns across the courtyard stones. Ziria stepped lightly along the pathway, her ornate gown flowing behind her. Beside her, Elias walked at a slower pace, his gaze flitting from one alien flower to the next. I have to admit, Elias said, kicking a loose pebble along the path. This beats the dry plains back home. You don't see plants like these growing out of clay and sand. Ziria smirked, brushing her fingers against a vine that curled in response. Nature can be cultivated, Elias. With the right guidance, even the most inhospitable worlds can blossom. Sounds like a metaphor, he replied. You're saying all my people need is a little guidance from your empire and will bloom too? She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Perhaps it's a metaphor, or perhaps it's an observation. Regardless, it doesn't change the beauty before us. Elias sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. Fair enough. It is beautiful, but I can't help thinking about the cost. Ziria paused under an archway woven from shimmering, translucent leaves. Everything worth having comes with a cost, she said softly. Even freedom. And sometimes the cost is too high, Elias replied, his voice quiet but firm. I've seen colonies join bigger alliances. Sure, they get stability, but they lose what made them unique. Their identity. She turned her gaze to the sky. The stars stretched endlessly, unchanging yet always in motion. Do you know why I brought you here? She asked, almost absent-mindedly. To convince me to join up, he guessed, leaning against one of the archway's supports. No, she looked back at him, her sharp features softened by the moonlight. I brought you here because I wanted to see what would happen when two completely different perspectives stood side by side. To understand what drives someone to refuse me, even when all logic says they should not. Elias scratched the back of his neck, feeling the weight of her stare. What did you expect to find? I didn't know, she admitted, and I still don't. You continue to surprise me. They stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Then Ziria stepped closer. The light from the bioluminescent plants cast a faint glow across her face, and Elias realized she wasn't looking past him anymore. She was looking directly at him. You are so unlike anyone I have ever encountered, she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. And yet, I cannot stop wanting to understand you. Elias felt his pulse quicken. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he watched as Ziria raised a hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his shoulder. Her touch was warm, and it sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through him. He didn't pull away. If anything, he found himself leaning slightly toward her. I don't have answers for you, he said finally, his voice unsteady. I don't even know if what I'm doing is right. You are not afraid to admit that, she said. That alone sets you apart. Her hand lingered on his shoulder, and he saw a rare uncertainty in her eyes. It was as if she, too, was stepping into unknown territory. Slowly, she closed the gap between them, her other hand resting lightly on his arm. Elias stood frozen, unsure whether to move away or close the distance himself. The choice was taken from him when Ziria tilted her head slightly, her gaze flicking briefly to his lips, then back to his eyes. The first touch of her lips against his was hesitant, a question rather than a statement. Elias blinked, caught off guard, but his body reacted before his mind could. His hands rose, one gently touching her waist, the other lightly brushing her arm. She didn't pull back. Instead, the kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, as if each of them was testing the boundaries of this unfamiliar connection. It wasn't frantic or passionate, but rather something delicate, as though they were both afraid of breaking the moment. Her hands settled on his shoulders, her touch firm yet soft, and Elias felt himself relax, the tension in his muscles fading as they found a rhythm. The world around them seemed to fade, the sounds of the garden and the glow of the plants blurring into the background. When she finally broke the kiss, Ziria didn't move far. Her forehead rested lightly against his, her eyes still closed. You're not what I expected, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Neither are you, Elias replied, his breath warm against her cheek. She stepped back slowly, her hands slipping away from him. Her expression was hard to read, a mix of wonder and caution. Perhaps that is why we keep finding ourselves here. Here? Elias asked, a small, unsure smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Here, she said, gesturing not just to the garden, but to the space between them, the fragile connection that had formed, unspoken yet undeniable. Elias let out a soft chuckle, scratching the back of his head. I guess I'll stick around a little longer then. Ziria's lips curved into a faint smile. Perhaps we both will. Chapter 7, Breaking Chains. Ziria sat alone in her private chamber aboard the flagship, the weight of her empire pressing down on her. The galaxy's rulers, her advisors, her subjects, all were counting on her to maintain control, to keep the empire stable. And yet, her thoughts drifted, not to military strategy or interstellar trade, but to Elias, the man who had defied her, questioned her, and now unsettled her in ways she never expected. Her advisor, Vinas, entered the chamber silently. His expression betrayed a rare hint of concern. "Empress," he began, his voice careful, "there are whispers among the council. Some are uneasy about your interactions with the human." Ziria didn't look up. "Let them whisper. They have done so before, and they will again. With respect, it's more than whispers now," Vinas pressed. "They see your continued attention to the human as a distraction, a risk to the Empire's unity." Finally, Ziria lifted her gaze. "A risk? How? Has he threatened the Empire's security? Has he raised a rebellion?" "No, but his influence on you is apparent," Vinas said, choosing his words carefully. "You consult him on matters you once decided alone. You question policies you previously upheld without hesitation. It's unsettling to many." She leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze piercing through him. "Unsettling, because I am thinking differently, because I am considering perspectives beyond the Empire's traditions. Because you are changing," Vinas said bluntly, "and change can be dangerous." Ziria stood, the flowing fabric of her gown catching the light. "Change is only dangerous to those who fear losing their control. I have not abandoned the Empire. I am still its ruler." "But you are not the same ruler," Vinas said, his tone almost pleading. "And the council sees that. They see his influence. They see you vulnerable." The word hung in the air. Ziria's eyes narrowed. "Is that what they think? That I am weak because I choose to listen, to consider another viewpoint?" "Perhaps not weak," Vinas said cautiously, "but compromised." Ziria turned away, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the viewport. "Compromised? No, Vinas. I am not compromised. I am evolving. I am seeing the Empire for what it is and for what it could be. And if that makes the council uneasy, so be it." Vinas hesitated, then bowed his head. "As you wish, Empress." When he left, the chamber fell silent once more. Ziria's thoughts turned inward. She knew the council's concerns were not baseless. She had changed. Elias had challenged her, not just with his words, but with his very presence. He had shown her a world that didn't rely on her empire's structure, a world that still found strength in its independence. And now, that very independence threatened to unravel the control she had spent centuries building. Later that evening, Elias found Ziria in one of the observation lounges, seated near the expansive window that overlooked the planet below. He approached cautiously, noting the way her usually composed features seemed troubled. "Is this a bad time?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. Ziria didn't look at him immediately. "When isn't it a bad time?" Elias chuckled, stepping closer. "Fair enough. But seriously, you look distracted." "Merely considering my next move," she said, her tone clipped. "You mean how to keep your council from revolting without turning me into a scapegoat?" Elias said, pulling up a chair beside her. Ziria's head turned sharply, her expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "How do you—" "Come on," Elias interrupted. "I'm not stupid. Your advisors have been giving me the cold shoulder ever since I arrived. I figure it's only a matter of time before someone tries to pin all their problems on me." "You are not as insignificant as they believe," Ziria said, her voice softer now. "But that only makes their fear greater." Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "So what are you going to do?" She stared at him, her golden eyes searching his face. "That is the question, isn't it?" "I'm serious," Elias said. "What's the play? If they see me as a threat, what's stopping them from trying to get rid of me?" "Me," Ziria said firmly. "You are here under my protection." Protection only lasts as long as you're willing to stand against them, Elias pointed out. And if you stand against them too long, they'll start to wonder why. They'll start to question you. And then what? Ziria closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to block out the truth of his words. When she opened them again, there was a resolve in her gaze. Then I must show them that change is not weakness. That questioning tradition is not betrayal. Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but if we're going to do that, you're going to need more than just words. You need to prove it. How do you suggest I do that? She asked, tilting her head. We start by working together, Elias said. If the council sees that I'm not a threat, that I can actually help make things better, it might take some of the heat off you. Ziria considered this, her expression softening slightly. It would be a risk. Maybe, Elias said with a shrug. But what do you have to lose that you aren't already risking? A faint smile touched her lips. You are infuriatingly logical for someone so stubborn. I'll take that as a compliment, he said with a grin. Ziria shook her head, but her smile lingered. Very well, Elias. We will try it your way. Glad to hear it, Elias said, leaning back in his chair. Now, let's figure out what we're going to do first. Chapter 8. 1,000 Worlds Changed. The council chamber was packed. Delegates from every corner of the empire filled the tiers of seats that curved around the central platform. Holographic screens displayed shifting maps of interstellar trade routes, economic data, and recent disputes. It was a gathering where every decision rippled out to 1,000 worlds, and today's agenda had drawn unusual attention. At the center of it all stood Empress Ziria. Her gown reflected the light from the screens, giving her an almost ethereal glow. But there was no hiding the tension in her posture. Beside her, Elias shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't wearing ceremonial garb or even a formal uniform, just his usual worn jacket and boots. He stuck out like a sore thumb in the opulent setting, and everyone noticed. Whispers rippled through the chamber as Ziria stepped forward. She held up a hand, and the murmuring ceased. Her voice was clear, resonant. Delegates, today we address not just policy, but the very foundation of our empire's future. For centuries, we have thrived through unity, structure, and control. But unity must not come at the cost of innovation or perspective. She paused, scanning the room. Elias, step forward. Elias glanced at her, then at the crowd, before reluctantly stepping onto the central platform. He'd never felt more out of place. He scratched the back of his neck, his gaze darting between the alien faces that stared down at him. Hi, he said awkwardly. A low murmur swept through the chamber again, but Ziria silenced it with a glance. This man represents a colony that has chosen to remain outside our empire's formal structure, and yet they have thrived. They have adapted, built, and prospered without our direct intervention. Elias and his people have shown us that strength does not only come from conformity. Elias cleared his throat. Look, I'm not here to tell you how to run things. I'm just here because... Ziria placed a hand lightly on his arm. Elias, you don't need to defend yourself. You're here because your perspective is valuable. He looked at her, then back at the crowd. Fine. If you want my perspective, here it is. We just want to be left alone to figure things out our way. But that doesn't mean we hate your empire. It just means we don't want to lose who we are. A tall, regal-looking delegate stood and addressed Ziria directly. Your Majesty, with respect, how does one small colony's independence benefit the greater whole? Why should we allow exceptions when unity has always been our strength?